Welcome to InSight Crime's 10th anniversary. My name is Jeremy McDermott. I'm one of the two founders and directors of InSight Crime. I'm sat here in our main office in Medellin, Colombia. The other director, Stephen Dudley, sat in Washington, D.C., and you'll be seeing plenty of him in a minute. I'd like to start by expressing thanks to some of the people who've been absolutely crucial in the development of InSight Crime over the last decade. The first is our team, absolutely extraordinary group of people from a multitude of different nationalities. They're scattered across the Americas and in Europe. Their dedication and courage has made InSight Crime what it is today. You guys go far beyond the call of duty. A second thanks has to go to our funders and supporters. Here, a special mention for Open Society Foundations. 10 years ago, they took a risk on us. They gave us the seed money to start up InSight Crime, and they have supported us ever since. Also, the American University, particularly Eric Hirschberg, who also reached out to us 10 years ago when we were starting up. This has been a long relationship, and we continue to work with the American University. And Eric is the head of the board, and he works with Alejandro Ope and Arlene Tickner. The board do an extraordinary job keeping Steve and I on the straight and narrow. Many thanks to you. And finally, huge thanks to all of you, our readers and audience. We now have more than 10,000 visits a day to the websites, and we want to keep an even closer touch with you going forward. Please contact us. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, as we continue to shine the light on perhaps the greatest single threat to Latin America and the Caribbean, and the source of many of its ills, organized crime. We're going to now show you a short video that we've prepared to celebrate the 10th anniversary.
Organized crime is a transnational phenomenon and respects no national borders. There are few cities in the world that have suffered more at the hands of organized crime than Medellin in Colombia. Here, perched within the Andes Mountains, is the city where InSight Crime was born and continues to have its headquarters, along with its other principal office in Washington, D.C.
In 2009, Stephen Dudley came to do some reporting in Medellin and stayed with me. We were both correspondents at the time, bemoaning falling interest and budgets for investigative journalism in Latin America, particularly around the issue of organized crime that we felt was at the heart of so many stories. We wanted to fill that hole, and with funding from Open Society Foundations, InSight Crime was born.
A year later, InSight Crime launched with 5 people. Today, it has more than 50 scattered around Latin America and the United States. Our mission is to study the single greatest challenge to the region, the motor behind record levels of homicides, systematic human rights abuses, corruption, and the undermining of democracy, organized crime.
This isn't something you can do from a distance, from afar. You have to be on the ground, and we are on the ground. We are talking to the communities. We're talking to the law enforcement and security forces, and we're talking to the criminals themselves.
Organized crime is a transnational phenomenon and respects no national borders. That is why InSight Crime operates regionally, connecting the dots, explaining the threats in each of the different nations, and highlighting how criminal dynamics in one country can impact another, often miles away.
The daily lives of people in Latin America are impacted in almost every way by organized crime. And what we're trying to do is tell the story of those people. And we think if we can tell the story of those people, we can deepen people's understanding of organized crime. And we can also deepen the level of debate about what to do about organized crime.
Criminals come in all guises, from members of street gangs to presidents. We don't discriminate. We follow the evidence and we follow the story, no matter where it takes us.
InSight Crime is an invaluable resource for anyone who cares about Latin America's security and democracy. It is impossible to fashion any viable policy measure dealing with organized crime without InSight Crime's rigorous investigations.
InSight Crime is a hybrid organization combining academic rigor with investigative journalism, putting all the data we can find on our websites in both Spanish and English, and creating the most comprehensive watchdog on organized crime in the Americas. Our impact comes not just from our public reporting and analysis of drug trafficking, human smuggling, environmental crime, corruption, and all the other facets of organized crime, but from our backroom discussions, events, internship program, and meetings with local communities around the region. We also look hard at possible solutions and policies to tackle the different facets of organized crime, especially corruption, violence, and other national security threats.
InSight Crime's work is indispensable. With courage and clarity, the researchers provide authoritative documentation of how a range of criminal actors and networks operate in the region. No one else does this thorough, on-the-ground and dangerous research as effectively as they do.
Over the next 2 hours, we'll have two panels, both hosted by friends of ours. The first will look at the foundation of InSight Crime and the challenges we faced over the last 10 years. That'll be hosted by Juanita León, whose La Silla Vacía has become a touchstone for Colombian news, particularly political analysis. Then there'll be a short break where you can run off to the loo or make yourself a cup of tea or coffee. Then we'll go on to the second panel, which will look at the evolution of organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean over the last decade. That'll be hosted by Rob Mugger of the Igarapé Institute, which has become an authority on security issues in Brazil and indeed much further afield. So without further ado, over to you, Juanita.
It's wonderful that we created La Silla Vacía and InSight Crime almost at the same time, and I know how improbable success looked 10 years ago. So I wanted to start, Jerry, with asking you if you ever thought that you would reach to be 10 years old.
Was as a result of this uncertainty in the media world. In 2008, a lot of the newspapers that Steve and I were working for were cutting back budgets. There was much less investigative journalism, much less interest, indeed, in getting really deep into the story. And so we set up InSight Crime as an attempt to continue doing some of the important work. And I have to say, without great expectations that we'd be able to make it work, let alone survive and grow over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think 10 years ago, there were, at least in Colombia, there were less than 2 million with internet subscription, and it was by phone. So it was very unlikely that you were going to have this success. And Steve, you had written wonderful book. You both were really good correspondents, and you created InSight Crime thinking that you were going to write, to investigate, but then you ended up running a business, 50 people on the staff, having to fundraise. Have you had time really? I mean, how do you make time to write? It seems like such a luxury when you do all this, no?
Yes, is the answer. Absolutely. a total luxury to be able to write and to be able to really take a step back and think. There is, too much to do all the time, and most of what we're doing is this administration. We are, facing down administrative hurdles. And Jerry and I were never trained in this. We didn't go to business school. We didn't, get any, special training to figure out how to manage people. We're not experts in budgets. So, we kind of had to, and this as well from experience, we had to figure it out as we went along. Of course, we sought out great people to advise us along the way, and you cannot make this sort of organization without getting that key consulting and advisement along the way. But, a lot of it is, you are figuring it out and you are learning as you go. And certainly we've gotten better, and I'm sure we'll continue to get better. We're going through this long process of professionalization. And then along the way, you kind of lose yourself because, thought you might be doing when you started it. We said, oh, yeah, this is great. We'll be able to do all the investigations we ever wanted. And that's not the case. You do have to spend a lot of time working with people, developing the organization, and as you said, fundraising.
Yeah, but at the same time, you two guys still write a lot and do a lot of investigations. So how do you organize yourselves inside? I mean, is Jerry playing like the army officer, making everyone march very fast? Or so how do you do it?
Yeah, I'll let Jerry answer the army officer stuff. On my end, I am very much, the stuff that you want to do on your own, you have to do before the day starts. Okay. So pretty much 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. is mine. And then the rest of the day is somebody else's. So that's kind of the way it works for me.
Okay. And how about you, Jerry?
As for the army officer persona, I've had to leave that far in the past. Running InSight Crime is like trying to herd cats. These guys do their own thing. They do it very well. And there's a lot of moving parts. Obviously, pre-COVID, we would have a lot of people in the field at the same time in different parts of Latin America, sometimes in quite hairy places. So Steve and I are concentrated most of the time on keeping an eye on everybody, making sure everybody's safe. Everybody's able to do their job, and then helping corral all this extraordinary information that comes in from the investigations, and then either pushing it onto the page or to the different governments that we work for. As far as the writing is concerned, we set this up exactly as Steve said. The idea is that we were going to be able to do all the investigations that we wanted and have the great luxury of taking your time to do investigations, which is in our previous incarnations as journalists for the Miami Herald or the BBC, we didn't have, running for deadline after deadline. We still do manage to carve out time for the writing because, that's really the reason to get up in the morning. But running this organization is not a bad thing. They're absolutely fabulous people, continual challenges, and we're able, thanks to this staff, to get across many more stories than we ever thought we would be able to do. So at the same time as we have people deep diving into stuff in Venezuela, there are teams working in the Northern Triangle in Central America. We're now currently pushing into the Caribbean. Always something new. And I have to say, I can't imagine doing anything else, and frankly, I'm unemployable to anyone else now.
About these incredible people that you have hired, and I found in these 10 years running La Silla Vacía that finding the right people is basically the hardest thing that I have faced during all these years. And I can't imagine finding the right people to work on investigating organized crime. That is high risk, is complicated, having access to the sources. So how do you find the people? I mean, I know that you have a very interesting intern program, but how do you do that? I don't know,
I'll
maybe.
start on this and then I'll pass it over to Steve. We've made some mistakes, without doubt, but we found that we initially thought that we would hire people like us, investigative journalists, and that would be a relatively easy prospect because, of course, so many journalism outlets have been closing, traditional outlets particularly over the last 10 years. But we've also found ourselves, Juanita, dragged away from our purely journalist roots into this kind of hybrid organization which has got, academic rigor and has to do policy analysis. And so we found that the best way is to catch them young, to get people who have just graduated from university or just graduated from their masters.
We lost your voice, so
Okay.
maybe. Okay, so sorry. Can
am
you
I back
start
again?
again? Because yes,
Am I
you're
back
back
again?
again.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, you're back again. So sorry, you have to start again.
What we found is our best strategy for finding the right people is to get them young and get them as they're leaving university or as they just finished their masters. And then we have a very exhaustive training process, which can take up to a year, where we train people in the hostile environments, we train people in emergency first aid, we train them in interview techniques, we train them in this mix of journalism and academia. And those that survive this and want to stay with us after being put through the ringer end up being, well, perfect for us and a very strange mix of skills. What has been particularly gratifying for us is that many of the people we've taken fresh out of university have done a couple of years with us, they've gone away to do their masters, and then they've come back to us with all the extra discipline and knowledge that the master's course has provided. And they're now going on to senior leadership positions within the organization. So you're right, the personnel is the hardest, the most challenging, but also the most rewarding part of InSight Crime. And I feel now we really do have the right people.
Steve, do you want to say anything more about this, or should I go to the next one?
You can go to the next one. Go ahead. I think Jerry thoroughly answered that.
Okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, I had a question about the job as such, because I think covering organized crime, finding the sources, it's really difficult because either the information is reserved as national security, or if your sources are the criminals, they don't want to be found by definition. So how do you go about your sources? I mean, it just seems such a difficult task.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is just that I think it's just what you said. I think that you can't expect these things to be perfect, and they're not perfect. And the way that we try and put these stories together is also not perfect. You can't get a perfect story, a perfect picture of what's happening with organized crime. So, you do have certain expectations, and what I guess I'm just sort of speaking for myself and what I try and teach to the staff is that it's just small increments and working sources over a period of a long time, and working a wide variety of sources. I like to start with somebody who's like a person who knows a lot of things about what I'm after, and just talk to that person for a very long time about what the situation is, and if they know other people I should speak to. And then you begin to open up those doors, and those doors are everybody from community level leaders to victims of crime, to lawyers, to prosecutors, to security forces, and you're just starting to knock on doors. And so that's all the human element. And then there's kind of a documentation element. There are a lot of these things play out in public. They play out in public in various forums, very often in the courts, so the court systems. And we do a lot of work with documents that come from the court systems. Then they also play out kind of behind the scenes via memorandums and intelligence reports. Sometimes we can get access to those, or at least talk to people who have access to those sorts of things. And then they play out also in the media and other sort of secondary sources. And so you begin to sort of put together the picture based on all of these inputs. And if you're lucky enough, you can get to people who are involved also in the criminal activities. And that takes a little bit longer, a little bit more work. And we rely on a lot of things, access via, these security forces sometimes are accessed via friends or contacts that you pick up over the years. So, there's a lot of different ways. You take all these inputs and you try and give the best picture that you can. Again, not perfect, but the best picture that you can of what's happening.
In the beginning, you were talking about how organized crime is our biggest threat to Latin America. And what I have seen covering politics is that if you scratch a little bit the surface of politics or of some businesses, you sometimes find organized crime underneath. And I suppose that those are the stories that are harder to cover because, of course, criminals are used to, like if you talk about them, okay, so who cares? But if you talk about these legal people that have these connections to illegal people, that makes it very dangerous because they have a lot to lose. And I was wondering, Jerry, if that's been the most difficult stories. I mean, you write about these invisible drug dealers, but what happens to these visible people that have these connections to the invisible people? I mean, is it okay is it enough to be just a nice English guy, or does it really make it very difficult?
I think being a nice British guy gets you a very long way.
I'm sure of that.
No, what we often forget is that criminals have been learning over the last 40 years as well. And we still have in our mind the idea of the Pablo Escobar, cocaine cowboy as running these enormous criminal enterprises. But the truth today is that the real power behind organized crime often has the face of a legitimate businessman, often has the face of a politician, or can have the face of a member of the security forces. And so, and there are two weapons that organized crime has, which is, of course, violence, extreme violence, and corruption. As Escobar said, it was the plomo, the lead for the violence, or the plata, the silver for corruption and bribery. And today, for sophisticated organized crime, it's all about the corruption. And we see that over the last 30 or 40 years in Latin America, organized crime has been continually and gradually penetrating the legal world. The businesses, obviously, I look out of the window here in Medellin and I see high rises everywhere. It looks like Manhattan. When I arrived here 20 years ago, there was hardly any high rises, and that is in no small part, drug money that has taken over much of the economy in this city. And now, 30 or 40 years in, it's very hard to divide the clean money from the dirty money. The same has been happening in the political world. Drug traffickers and organized crime have been funding political campaigns at municipal, provincial, and national level for decades now. And in many parts of Latin America, it's almost impossible to get elected unless you have a boost in terms of some financial support from organized crime. It makes the story so much more difficult to get, so much more complex to tell, and unfortunately so much more risky to do.
Yeah, I could tell by this Memo Fantasma story that really made a splash in Colombia, and that, you know, they threatened, you know, the vice president, they threatened you with a lawsuit. She finally take it back. But I was wondering also if, besides the threats, you are getting a lot of lawsuits, which I always find that good news because that means they're not going to kill you. But is it really a burden, Steve? How do you handle that?
We handle it on a rolling basis. I mean, I think we got our first lawsuit about a year after we started. It came via a third party who was mentioned in a very long report we had about the Petén. And, you know, for us it was startling, but I think for American University president of the time, it was even more startling because the letter was sent directly to American University's president. And so it's not just us on the line here. We obviously are representing other institutions, and we have to keep that in mind. The frequency of the lawsuits has increased in the last couple of years in particular. And, you know, I think it is you know, in a way a result of the world in which we live, in which you increasingly have these very direct links between criminal organizations and political blocs, and they have very clear interests that they're seeking to protect. I'll never forget in 2013 when we were doing a long report on organized crime and a very powerful criminal group in Honduras, and this group had a lot of contact with one of the wealthiest men in Central America. And I went to his office to speak to him, you know, finally got an interview with him, and brought in a large stack of papers about this big that I wanted to show to him and say, you know, listen, I want to talk to you about your relationship with this criminal organization. And, you know, you speak about this sort of, you know, nice British, you know, persona getting you through a lot of things. Well, I expected him to immediately say, well, I'm going to sue you, and, you know, you need to get out of my office right now. And instead, and this may surprise people, he told me the story. He said how he had originally come in contact with the criminal organization, the relationship they developed over the years. He showed me checks that they had signed. You know, he brought his daughter in to explain more about the relationship. He thought, in other words, it was perfectly justified. And what's more, he thought that I would walk out of there satisfied with his explanation and then, you know, not do anything about it. And he said, well, what are you going to do with this? I said, well, I'm going to publish this. And that was when the surprise kind of hit him. And thankfully, that was at the end of the meeting. And we were done. And yes, we did publish it. And, you know, yes, his family did come under, eventually come under indictment. So, you know, this is the sort of relationship that has evolved to the point where they don't think that it's even strange that they have these relationships. They justify these relationships. So I think part of it has just become almost sort of the fabric of what's happening within the political elites.
Well,
can I add something there, Juanita?
Sure. No, you can't. No, yes, of course.
You mentioned it in your in your introduction. This is one of the greatest threats any of us face in the digital publishing or the publishing world, is the threat of a lawsuit. Thankfully, not one of the multitude of lawsuits that we've ever faced we've ever come close to losing. And this is what keeps Steve and I awake at night, and what also keeps us laser focused on what we publish. Because we know that if we ever put anything up on the website that is not correctly sourced, is not thoroughly investigated, and is biased in any way, we are going to get hammered in the law courts. And so this has been something that has forced us and forced all of our staff to be doubly disciplined, to go back to the sources and make sure that whatever we publish is absolutely bulletproof, because all it takes is one successful lawsuit, as you know, and financially it could bring us to our knees.
Yeah, and talking about not sleeping, I feel that, you know, running a media like this is very exhausting. You work a lot of hours. And I'm wondering, what are the rewards? I mean, in these 10 years that you have worked, what have been like the 2 or 3 stories that have made you really happy and that you feel that what you're doing is really worth it? Because I think that journalists, we always face this existential crisis of, okay, why would we do this? Is it really worth it? What is changing? You know, organized crime is still quite prevalent in Latin America. So what is your measure of success? I mean, when do you really go to celebrate at night?
Jerry, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah. Okay. Steve and I have this conversation at the end of every single year of the last 10 years, which has been, we can't continue like this. We've got to slow down. We've got to get a life. And we can't live under this continual stress of you know, running InSight Crime and doing these stories and all the pressure it brings. And every year we continue to do it, and we love it. And I think you're right, Juanita. What makes it worthwhile is sometimes some of the arrows hit the target. Because, as you say, organized crime just seems to be getting stronger and stronger in many parts of the region. And so, you know, we sometimes wonder if we are having any serious success or any long-term impact on the problem. But you mentioned the Memo Fantasma story, which an investigation that you know, I absolutely loved to work on. The team was really enthused by, and we managed to shine the light on something that we've been talking about, which is the hidden side of organized crime. Someone, in this case, a guy called Guillermo Acevedo, who started in the Medellin cartel, had continued in the Oficina Envigado, the criminal structure here in Medellin, was then in the paramilitaries, and then living the high life in Madrid, completely free, completely without charge, no one looking at him. And he led us to the vice president of Colombia, whose company had been involved with him in the construction of an enormous office building in Bogota, which you know, Memo Fantasma had used to launder money. And suddenly all the pieces came together for me in one story, and we identified this man. We identified, and we're going to continue working on this, we began to shine the light on basically a case of total impunity, someone who has got away with murders, with money laundering, with drug trafficking, been involved in massacres, and that very small success and very small impact makes it worthwhile and makes you want to do it all over again.
Jerry, one of the people that are watching us, they ask us if this investigation was the biggest challenge that you guys have faced, or if there are other investigations that have challenged you even more than that one. Steve?
No, Steve, if you want to answer that.
Well, I think there are different types of investigations, and some investigations put you at certain type of risk, and others put you at a different type of risk. I mean, there's a sort of physical risk. We've done investigations that have brought us in and out of prisons, for example, and that's always a very difficult place to control, in terms of your environment. And as a person who wants to do an interview in an environment in which you want to know what's happening around you, well, prison is not the best place. But, so those are very difficult and dangerous, and we've done those in the past. And then there's the other side of the equation, which we've already touched on, this sort of legal side. And those are also very difficult for a lot of reasons, just, for nothing else, but to get all the documentation together that actually establishes without doubt these connections, these interactions between these elites and between these criminal organizations. And if you get one thing wrong, then, not only do you lose credibility, but you could also face a very serious lawsuit. And thinking back, we've done a lot of, this sort of the whole gamut of these types of investigations. And when you ask about sort of, what do I think about? I think about some of the first stuff we did with the Zetas criminal organization and their incursion, very violent incursion into Guatemala, which was really kind of when we first started out. And the investigation, and in fact the video we made a very big splash at the time. And what I realized was that, there wasn't necessarily anybody doing those types of stories, those deep dives into those criminal organizations and explaining those criminal organizations in those spaces, especially places like Central America. And what I've seen over the years is the evolution of other organizations that work on this topic, and how they've definitely picked up this same type of rhythm and this same type of sort of nerdy organized crime scope that we have, and we think that's great. We think that's kind of an ancillary effect, hopefully, that we've had on others, and we think that's great. And then the other thing, in terms of like when I become sort of proud of what we did, I think one of the best projects we did was this thing on elites and organized crime, because so much of what we think about when we think about crime is kind of bottom up, street gangs and drug cartels and that sort of thing. And what we did is we tried to do look at it from the top down, and break down those networks from the top down, because they're so important and they're so vital to everything that's happening right now. So I'm really proud of that work that we did, and I think we kind of reset the table a little bit also on organized crime when we did that.
Well, there are a lot of very brainy questions coming along, but I wanted to ask you a light one before we go into them, and it's about your partnership. I mean, I think having a media with a partner is almost like having like the worst of the marriage without any of the benefits. And I wanted to ask you, how has it been? I mean, how do you, what are your strengths, Steve, versus Jerry's? How do you distribute the responsibilities among yourselves?
You better answer that, Steve. You're the diplomatic part of this relationship. Right?
I think that just that answer right there can give you a little idea about it. I think that we have both played all different types of roles in the organization. I think certainly Jerry is and can be a little bit more of the heavy hand. Maybe that's some of his military background. I'm not sure. I'm not going to speak to that. Um, and perhaps I come at this with a slightly different perspective, but it's also because I'm very far away from a good portion of the staff. I think one of the things that we realized pretty quickly after COVID started was that we were ready for COVID, because we've had a virtual office for 10 years. We've never not had a virtual office. So we were completely prepared for that in a lot of ways. But getting back to sort of your question, there were different ways we could divide this up, and we have ended up dividing it up geographically. So, Jerry would handle and is handling kind of much more the Andean region, and parts beyond. We now, as he said, we're moving into the Caribbean, so he's handling a lot of that. I've handled a lot more of the Central America, managed the Central America and Mexico aspect, and then later on in the last couple of years we've done a lot of work in the Southern Cone. So we've divided it up geographically. We've divided it up administratively. Initially, I did much more of the fundraising, because I was in the spot where there was a lot more funds to be had, and Jerry did a lot more of the administrative work. And now we've shifted that around a little bit, to now it's a little bit more sort of half and half. I'd almost say that Jerry probably does even more of the fundraising now than I do. So, we've shifted around in various ways, and then we each kind of have, we've been fortunate to have kind of our interests in certain types of projects, and been able to get those projects and then execute those projects to our liking. So in a lot of ways, I think we've probably worked together on a project maybe 3 or 4 times in 10 years. Which may sound weird, but that's because we're running kind of our own projects apart from the other, and they always kind of take on our personalities, which are slightly different, and our approaches, which are slightly different. Yeah, so I think we've been fortunate in that regard, that we have been able to still pursue, our own interests and kind of shape them around our own personalities. So, I don't know what Jerry would say about that, but.
Okay, well, I'm going to try and be diplomatic now. Yeah, Steve and I are very much oil and water, very different personalities. And I think that has actually been one of the secrets to the success of InSight Crime. I tend to be abrasive and direct and quite often fairly horrible. And Steve's much nicer, much softer, and from the staff point of view, that's worked very well. It also works quite well, I think, from a business perspective, because I can do something abrasive and offensive, and Steve can then mend it, and then we get the contract that we're looking for. And I also think having Steve's roots are obviously journalism, but also much more human rights, and then my roots, journalism and war correspondency, and the military, provide two sides of what now seems to be becoming quite a valuable coin. So I think it's been one of the greatest strengths that Steve and I are very different. I know that he reins me in a lot when I'm about to go off on a dangerous tangent, and perhaps I occasionally push Steve into an area that he doesn't want to go, but that ends up being extremely good for InSight Crime. So it's a marriage made in hell, but it's been working very well.
Well, that's great, like good marriages. And there's a question from our audience about how COVID has affected your work. And you say that you were prepared for COVID because you work remotely, but also you work a lot on the field, and that's become a little bit more difficult during this pandemic. So I was wondering, Steve, how has that impacted your work?
I mean, tremendously. We've had to stop all travel, and certainly put in all the necessary protocols for people, even who are in Medellin, for example. Those who are going in and out of the office, certainly they're following all sorts of protocols in order to stay safe. But we haven't been able to do any field work, and we have had to change the way in which we're communicating to people. I think that thankfully people are receptive to that. They understand that. So we're still getting a lot of information, but it's not the same. You know this, Juanita. What is it? The expression in Colombian, what do you guys say? Face of an angel makes for miracles. And it is that sense. You do kind of have to be with people. You have to talk to them. You have to, relate with them on that human level often to get the information that you're looking for. And develop the relationships that you need in order to get the information that you're looking for. And so it's been tough. I'm not going to lie. We're trying to figure out how much we can do remotely, and then working with people who are in those areas more and more to go and recover some of the information that we need, or do some of the interviews that we need. In other words, since we can't travel, and they're already there, then they can interact with the people. But it's not the same. It's not the same. Definitely been difficult.
Yeah, it's very difficult for us too. And Jerry, there is another question relating sources, and particularly, how do you go about finding sources in the criminal world? For example, in Central America, how do you do that?
Steve's talked a little bit about this. I kind of divide the sources into three groups. The first group is the most obvious one, which is law enforcement, government, the judicial system. The second group, which I think is mostly the overlooked one, are the communities that live every day with organized crime, that cohabit with organized crime. And that's the great advantage of our model in walking the ground. Because this is where, for me anyway, we always get our best information. It's from the people who are not criminals, but live in and around the criminal world. And then, of course, the third group are the criminals themselves. And
yeah, I think the question is more regarding them.
The criminals themselves, yeah. You often get to the criminals themselves through either those who are in prison, then we have a captive audience, and then all you have to do is persuade them to talk to you, either through the lawyers or through other friends and acquaintances. But walking the ground has often led to the most surprising access to the criminal world. And that, I think, for me, has been where some of the most unexpected interviews have come. And to take the Colombia context, which you know well, Juanita, if you're walking around a guerrilla or organized crime stronghold, they're going to know in the first 5 seconds of you stepping off the plane or getting out of the car that you're there. The most extreme example I remember was in Putumayo in the south of Colombia, one of the big coca growing regions and heart of the organized crime. I got out of the taxi in the airport, and I got out of the airport and I got into a taxi, and I said, "Could you take me to the paramilitary headquarters?" And the taxi driver didn't blink, and he just took me to the paramilitary headquarters, where I sat down with Comandante Alcon, Commander Hawk, and began the investigative process. So that second group of the people that live in and around organized crime often allows you to get direct access to the criminals. The other one is, and the Memo Fantasma story was very interesting, because the first raft was built around criminal sources, but since then we've received, I don't know, dozens of contacts from criminal figures saying, I can't believe you managed to expose Memo Fantasma. Do you want more of the story? So you can't underestimate the fact that criminals reach out to us as well. And obviously that's increased over the last 10 years as we've become more known, a little more notorious. And that has certainly allowed us to get deeper and deeper contacts in the criminal world.
Okay, hearing you about this Comandante Halcón, I have a very silly question, but aren't those nicknames really amazing? I mean, does it surprise you still? You know, El Osito, Memo Fantasma. I mean, there's such a peculiar names. No?
I have to say, it's one of the more amusing aspects of what tends to be a rather dark profession. The other thing is that most of these nicknames aren't based in some incredible heroic or rugged act that the criminal has done. They tend to be given to them by someone else for some terrible mistake they made or some horrible weakness that they have. So
we have a lot of, I mean, we have a lot of, I mean, you know, it's, of course, we've run into all kinds of things over the years with these nicknames. You know, do we translate them or not? You know, when they spell something that is supposed to be in English wrong, do we correct it or put it in a parentheses? Do we put them in quotations or not? I mean, like kind of stupid things that you wouldn't think about. We've had to face down these questions, but we've also tried to have fun with it. We've created a narco culture section. And one of the stories we did was all the different Reina del Pacífico. There were like 6 queens of the Pacific. And so we gave little snippets about each queen of the Pacific, you know, and there was one in Bolivia, and there was one in Guatemala, and there was one in Mexico. You know, it's just great. Like, so any woman who reaches a certain stature becomes the queen of the Pacific, I guess. So, you know, we tried to have a little bit of, a little bit of fun without being too flippant.
So what's the funniest nickname that you have run into? That's always
the funniest ones cannot be said out loud, Juanita. They tend to revolve around sexual inadequacy or physical deformities. So let's leave that one, shall we?
Okay, so I'll ask you a hard question from the audience, and it's how do you go about working in intense conflict areas such as Colombia or Mexico? I mean, you've already explained how do you access the sources, but what kind of what kind of protection do you actually have to go into these very intense conflict areas?
I'll start on that one and then maybe pass to Steve. This is the thing we never joke about, which is the security of our people in the field. And we have really strict security protocols. So before we even think about stepping into the field in Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, Venezuela, these are all at the moment some of the most dangerous places that we're operating. We do like a security analysis, a risk analysis, and if we decide that it's too risky to go to a certain place, then that's it. We just don't go to the place. If we decide it's risky but manageable, then we will put as many measures in place as possible to reduce the level of risk. And the most obvious one is we'll never go anywhere without a local, someone who really knows the area, who knows the people, knows the communities. If that person also happens to be what we call a guarantor, who might be a community leader or a priest or a social worker who's very respected in the communities, then that person lowers the level of risk even further. The other measures we might put in is we will parachute in. What we mean by that is we will never spend any time in a high-risk area, but if we need to get in there and we need to speak to someone, we will go in very quickly, we'll do the interview, and we will disappear out again. And for example, working in Catatumbo, Juanita, which you know well, it was just too dangerous at the time we were there to spend the night. So we would get up at 3 in the morning, we would drive in so that we are there at 7 o'clock to have breakfast with a couple of sources. As soon as the mayor's office opens at 8 o'clock, we're in the mayor's office, we do all the interviews, and bang, we're out by lunchtime, so that no one really has any time to organize anything too unpleasant. So security is far and away our biggest concern. Every team that is in the field has a security supervisor. This is someone who is back in base, who knows exactly what all their interviews are, where they're supposed to be at any one time, and thanks to WhatsApp, usually can be in real-time contact with people, so they're completely following their progress. And if anything isn't right, Steve and I always have the rule: you pull out. We can always do an interview by phone. We can always go back a different time, or we can do the story without that. It's never worth risking your life if things are if the wheels are beginning to come off.
I would just add to that, just Juanita, just one thing. Obviously we're erring on the side of caution as it relates to us and our personnel, but we're also erring on the side of caution as it relates to our sources. And so, just as we have security protocol, we're also very wary of their own security as well. We are constantly asking questions of them to make sure that they themselves are not going to be exposed, or if they are, they understand the exposure and the risks that come with it. So, certainly we're concerned about ourselves, but we're also thinking about our sources.
Steve, one of the last questions that they've sent me is if you have thought about expanding in Europe and Africa.
There's only 24 hours in the day. I mean, we have talked about it. We've certainly, I used to joke and say that we were going to cut off, part of our name, because we put part of the name was, in the Americas, and that we were just going to cut that off. And Jerry panicked, and he just said, no way, there's no way we're doing that. We've done things that bring us into other regions, most notably Europe and Africa. But, we don't have the bandwidth right now. We're okay. This is also our specialty too. It's a little bit, this is the region where Jerry and I cut our teeth as journalists, as investigators, as researchers. So, I'm not going to rule it out, but I'm also going to say that it's probably at this stage a remote possibility. I wouldn't be holding your breath for the next 10 years for us to sort of branch out worldwide.
I'd like to rule it out, but,
Okay, you have a little disagreement there about expectations, but before we go to the last question from me, one person asks, who is the person that you have interviewed that has been the most memorable person in InSight Crime?
I'll start with that then. For me, it was one of the heads of the FARC, alias Mono Jojoy, who was a legendary figure in Colombia, in the Colombian rebel movement of the FARC, and who has had I think he was the person that parents used to scare their children. If you're naughty, Mono Jojoy is going to come for you. And so when I met him, first of all, I was surprised how funny he was. He took the piss out of me ruthlessly, which I love. He was extremely well read, and he handled the interview like a professional. And also his bodyguard were all women. which was extremely distracting and disconcerting. But I spent about an hour with him, touching a variety of different subjects. I sought to provoke him every way I possibly could because I wanted to see the scary face of Mauna Hohoi. He never showed it. Yeah, for me, that definitely goes down as one of the most memorable, along with Carlos Castaño, who is the other side, who is the head of the paramilitary, the Colombian paramilitary movement. And I interviewed him maybe a month after I'd interviewed Mauna Hohoi, so I got both sides of the conflict and criminal spectrum.
Okay, so Steve, since we have to close now, I just wanted to ask you about the future of InSight Crime. I mean, where are you heading now? What do you envision for your next 10 years?
Well, I think a lot of what we're doing is very much with the same focus on the ground investigations to unearth a better understanding of organized crime. But I think we're going to try and push the boundaries a little bit on what is organized crime. And the first element of that would be certainly much more coverage of things like environmental crime. And the ways in which environmental crime is just accelerating the destruction of the environment in so many different ways, and how that is also sort of integrated into this sort of political economic elite blocks. And then the other are questions that maybe seem a little more esoteric, but are super fundamental to understanding why groups, organized crime groups, work and function the way they do. And that are things like gender. And not just like the question of, what is the role of the female in criminal groups. And, I was, making a joke earlier about the sort of Queen of the Pacific and all that. And that's certainly an element of this. But also the ways in which, truncating or emasculating the male, leads to the construction of very powerful criminal groups. And what I'm thinking of there are things like, physical or sexual assault inside prisons, and how they, how that foments the construction of very powerful criminal groups. These are questions that we hope to sort of push the boundaries on a little bit more, rather than just sort of, yes, we'll still be doing the sort of, seizures and captures and, big groups and small groups and drug trafficking and everything else, but we want to push the boundaries on some of these other topics.
Well, with this, we finish this panel before you go on the next one, but I'm so sure you're going to do all that, Steve, and a lot more. So it's been such a pleasure to have you guys, and congratulations. It's great that you reached your 10th year, and it's been so useful for people like me. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Juanita. Much appreciated. We're going to have a quick break now for about 5 minutes, and then we'll be back for the second panel. Thanks a lot, Juanita.
Okay.
celebrate 10 years of InSight Crime and to take a harder look at the evolution of crime. We spent the last hour looking at a bit of the story, the origin story, and today we're going to get into, in this session, some of the dirt. InSight Crime is really the organization that I often refer to as a little engine that could. It started out as two muckrakers and is now a mighty investigative media empire. And I'm really pleased and honored to be here with its two swashbuckling founders, Steve Dudley and Jeremy McDermott. Steve and Dudley are, of course, the pretty face of this organization. But as we heard in the previous hour, there's a tremendous team of over 50 researchers and administrators and partners who really give InSight Crime its capability and its reach. And I've had the opportunity to work with both Steve and Jer and their team in my capacity as the co-founder of the Igarabé Institute. We spent some time in Brazil, in Colombia, in Peru, El Salvador, all of it immensely entertaining and memorable. One thing I can say with certainty is that wherever we went, we were always recognized and we were rarely loved. And this has to be a sign that you, Jeremy and Steve, are doing your job well. So congratulations to both of you for making it to 10. This is a real accomplishment, something for which you both are and should be immensely proud. And so I want to walk through a bit today with you both on your highlight reel, right? Like, I want to give listeners a sense of the themes you've worked on, some of the big takeaway messages you've had, and of course, impacts. Where have we seen change? Where have we seen outcomes that you think you can be justly proud of? There's so much content that you produce. There's so many incredibly gobsmacking stories that pass across our Twitter feeds and our social media feeds. I think what we want to do this time is focus a bit on the ones that you think best capture your value add in this world of organized crime. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's start at the top of the organized crime food chain, elites. You guys started a multi-year project a few years ago to better understand the political economy of how crime really functions. And this is so important in Latin America, right? One of the most unequal parts of the world, outrageous levels of poverty and inequality, hyper concentration of wealth. So rather than focus on the bottom feeders or even the more colorful kingpins that you were discussing earlier with Juanita, you wanted to really understand who was pulling the strings. So Steve, tell us a bit about how elites fit in the picture. Why are they so important? And give us a 360 on that if you can.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks for doing this. The work that we did definitely started with a focus on what you referred to as the bottom feeders. I mean, we came at this from that sort of classic optic, the belief that this is something that is from the bottom up. And, we use all these terms to describe it, how it penetrates the state, how it sort of infects, political parties and things of that sort. And what we did then was a few years in, we sort of took a step back, and with funding from Canadian government, IDRC, we did a much longer project that decided that we were going to look at it from the inside out, so to say, and not think of it just as sort of, the politicians have been infected or the political parties have been penetrated, but rather think about them as the criminal organizations. And that's what we began to see and what we tried to chronicle in detail with this multi-year project. It ended up being about a 3-year project. And the project basically saw how these political and economic blocks were created and were intersecting, were really fusing with organized crime interests in ways that were giving them a huge amount of power. And in some instances, it was just a municipality. So you would get, I chronicled a very colorful mayor in the eastern part of Guatemala who calls himself Tres Quiebres. And, he was a person who got involved in connected to organized crime through his construction business, and then became an organized crime figure himself, and then decided to run for mayor. And then he became the mayor. And as mayor, then he also decided he was going to also run the local commission that was deciding all the public works projects So then he gets his hands on even more of the pie and starts to control other politicians. So you would get people like this and be able to describe how their, crime and political and economic tentacles would stretch out, maybe starting with a municipality, going to a regional scale, and then eventually we could even talk about a presidential level, which is what we have done in places, such as Honduras and Guatemala and Venezuela and, obviously other places around the region where these tentacles can reach all the way up to the presidency.
Do you have a sense that it's a function of crime capturing the state, or do we see the state itself also adapting to facilitate crime? Or is there a trajectory that you could see that it runs across time and space in Latin America, or is it just fuzzy and it just depends on the local historical context?
It's definitely both. It definitely goes both ways. We found criminals like Tres Quiebres, who went from being, let's say a small businessman to criminal entrepreneur to politician. And then we found cases where you had politicians who basically understood once they reached a certain level that their interactions with criminal actors, would be greatly beneficial to their own either political bloc or political enterprises or economic enterprises. We did a whole a story on the guy who's now the former Minister of the Interior of Guatemala. And he had basically created alliances with all the major, criminal drug trafficking groups and was collecting money from them for allowing them to do their business. He was a decorated Army veteran, a special forces guy who had been very powerful inside the military. So he kind of, can we say that he penetrated the state? Well, he was already part of the state. He was a major part of the state. And then he began to build out these alliances. So we've seen it go both ways.
Great. I want to kind of pivot. Thank you for giving the overall framework, but I want to pivot to Colombia. And Colombia is really important for InSight Crime, not least because you got a base there. And Jeremy's broadcasting from there. And by the way, I have to say, this is the longest I've ever heard Jeremy be quiet in my entire time of knowing him. So I'm going to get to you now, Jeremy. You both have this very special relationship with Colombia. You both married Colombians, and you spent a good part of your lives there. I should add that I lived there as well in the late 1990s and almost fell into that same trap. It's quite an extraordinary place for so many reasons. And you have this tremendous affection for this place, but I think you both have seen it as a kind of ground zero for organized crime in the Americas. There's no coincidence in a way that you're based there and you've got so much connection to this place. Jeremy, tell us a bit about why Colombia is so integral to the story of organized crime in the world. I want you to walk us through, and you did it a bit earlier, but walk us through a bit about the evolution of organized crime in Colombia, especially this relationship between the FARC and the AUC, and then essentially the growth of Escobar and the new generation of cartels. Why does Colombia matter? And what are the lessons we can draw from Colombia? Because it's not just been a center of gravity for organized crime, but it's also been an extraordinary place of experimentation and innovation around fighting crime. Why does Colombia matter to the story? And what can we learn from Colombia?
I think they can't. Can they hear me? Yeah?
You're back.
I'm back. Yeah, thanks for the easy question, Rob. Colombia not only has the cocaine and the principal supplier of and producer of cocaine, but for some reason, and I don't know if it's cultural, if it's economic, if it's political, but the Colombians have been the pioneers in the criminal world. And that's as true today as it was when Pablo Escobar started industrializing the smuggling of cocaine to the United States using aircraft. The other thing that has very much marked Colombia different to, say, Mexico, which is often seen as another one of the sort of centers of organized crime, has been the civil conflict. And the organized crime has provided the fuel for the civil conflict, and it's also created these highly disciplined, extremely capable militarily, and very entrepreneurial organizations. And you have to remember that the Colombian civil conflict's now in its 57th year, and the actors here, the guerrillas and the other criminal actors, have survived everything that not just the Colombian state, but the US-backed Colombian state has been able to throw at them for those 57 years. And so what it has done has created a criminal class that has been forged in the most adverse conditions you can imagine. And it's created some of the most powerful criminal syndicates the planet has seen. You mentioned the FARC and the paramilitaries. The paramilitaries demobilized 30,000 guys. They were controlling, at the height of their power, the exportation of between 20 and 30 tons of cocaine a month. And they controlled up to a third of the Colombian National Territory. The guerrillas controlled at least another third, and the government was kind of sat in the middle pretending that it controlled everything else. What we see, if we fast forward to today, Rob, I think it's really interesting to compare Colombia to Mexico. Everyone now talks about the Mexican cartels. Jalisco and Sinaloa. The recent images of the Jalisco cartel all lined up next to their Humvees, with high-level weaponry. The Colombians left all that behind a long time ago. The Colombian traffickers are businessmen. They are anonymous. It's interesting that today Colombia is moving more cocaine than ever in its history, and I defy you to name the top 5 Colombian traffickers. We just don't know who they are. And that is why the Colombians are so important in the current criminal panorama and so important in the evolution. And then the last thing I want to say is they essentially gave the US market to the Mexicans. The Colombians decided, okay, a kilo of cocaine is worth $25,000 in the US. There's high risk of interdiction, extradition, seizure of assets. That same kilo is worth $40,000 in Europe, $60,000 in Russia, $80,000 in China, and $100,000 in Australia, where there's much less risk of extradition, interdiction, and seizure of assets. Guess where we're going? And so even as cocaine production has continued to grow, they have simply diversified markets and created these multinational criminal networks that are becoming so hard to identify, confront, let alone dismantle.
So build on that a little bit. I mean, because I think there's been hundreds of billions of dollars poured into the war on drugs, poured into interdiction, poured into counter-narcotics, poured into a whole array of crop substitution programs, poured into fumigation. And yet this phenomenal statistic that you just raised, that production is as high as it's ever been, if not higher. I mean, that's quite an indictment of these investments. I want you to talk a little bit about how effective have been external and internal efforts to try to address not just the production of drugs, but dismantling organized crime. Because what you're suggesting is that organized crime, in a sense, has gone even more underground, has become more embedded with state institutions, has become more mysterious, and we'll get to this, invisible. But what does that say about interventions? You guys have spent a lot of time thinking about this. How would you rate efforts to try to dismantle? And that's a big question, but I'm sure you're good to answer.
I think we've also got to recognize that the Colombian security forces, justice system, and organized crime, anti-money laundering units are among the best, if not the best, in Latin America. So it's not like the criminals have been evolving unfettered and unchallenged. The Colombians lead Latin America in terms of their capacity to gather intelligence, to launch operations, to capture and dismantle structures. Plan Colombia, which was the multi-billion-dollar US aid package that began in 1999 and continues in various different forms to today, has been singularly ineffective in its main aim, which of course was reducing the flow of cocaine to the United States, utterly failed in that, but was crucial, I believe, in the FARC making peace and removing the most powerful guerrilla army in Latin America and arguably anywhere else from the stage. They were hammered, and Plan Colombia, which started as a counter-narcotics, became a counter-terrorism, and it began to shut all the spaces for the FARC until they got to the point where they just thought, you know what, the political route's looking good to me now. The other thing that's happened is this enormous pressure on Colombian organized crime has forced it to become so sophisticated, to become so invisible. And when we look at other parts of the world, like Brazil, which you know better than Steve and I put together, we have an organized crime that doesn't need to hide its face. The PCC are completely in your face. And because there is remarkably little resistance from the state, and they don't need to become more clandestine to explore different evolutionary paths, because there's no one yet pressuring them to do so.
Super. Little known fact, I was involved with the National Planning Department in Bogota in 1998-99, and I think I was one of the first people to see Plan Colombia in its unvarnished form when it was being put together. So
it's your fault, is what you're saying?
I will accept some blame with great apologies. One question on this. Before I move to the next question, I want to get to Mexico in a moment, but before I do, one of the other headline stories that you folks have reported on and that's generated some international press is the extraordinary violence decline in Colombia over the last 15 to 20 years. I mean, you were able to watch it in real time in the last decade, but it's been nothing short of stunning. And Medellin, of course, being one of these stories where the decline has been most pronounced. And so Colombia has gone from being one of the most violent countries on the planet to somewhere in the middle. I mean, it's still in the top tier in terms of gross numbers, but in terms of reported homicidal violence, we've actually seen a decline. There are two narratives about this, one of which is that this had a lot to do with really smart interventions, often municipally led or state led, or even, as you suggest, high level interventions that resulted in a stalemate of types and resulted in some of the more egregious forms of violence declining. Although I want to be clear that violence has not declined entirely in Colombia, that there still continues to be a lot of political assassinations and interpersonal crime. But the other narrative is sort of what you were implying. A decision was made that cartels and organized crime groups decided this wasn't the most effective or efficient way of doing business, and essentially called a halt. And there are all sorts of stories. You did some wonderful reporting in Medellin on this with the Office of Crime and others who were involved. Give us a sense, Steve and/or Jerry, which narrative dominates here? What do we believe?
I'll talk about Medellin, Rob, before I hand over to, because I think it's the perfect microcosm of everything that you're talking about. You know, in the days of Pablo Escobar, this was the most dangerous city in the world. When police were being gunned down on a daily basis, the murder rate was over 400 people per 100,000 of the population, and the scars very much still visible today. And Medellin has, to an outsider, you come to Medellin and you go, what's all the fuss about? You know,
Yeah.
this is a fabulous, dynamic, innovative city, one World City of Innovation, economic powerhouse, cultural powerhouse. And I think that the year 2010, 2011 best illustrates this, because this is when the municipal authorities under the mayors are building libraries. They're building our famous cable car systems that commute people down from the valley sides down to the middle. And people were going, you know, this is amazing. And it was pacifying areas, providing the community space that communities really need to be able to live a semi-normal life. But then the other flip side of the coin was the Oficina de Envigado and the Urabeños, the two principal criminal groups in the city, said, stop.
Yeah.
We're going to make a truce. This is bad for business. The fighting is getting us nowhere. Let's sort this out. And literally, in the space of a month, the murder rate halved. So there are definitely the two sides to the story, and I think we can't put too much weight on one narrative or the other. Steve has done a lot of work in El Salvador on the gang truce there, which again led to a fundamental and immediate drop in homicides without the flip side of social investment, without looking at the root causes. So I think both narratives are extremely important.
Steve, do you want to weigh in, or can I push on to the next?
Please push on. Yeah.
Let's push on to Mexico, a place that you know well and spend a lot of time in. And as Jerry, you mentioned, Mexico's overtaken, in a way, Colombia, at least in the popular imagination, as the epicenter of organized crime. And you know, you also insinuated that Mexican cartels were learning from Colombians. They were able to capture some of the value added of trafficking at the far end of the retail side. And in a way, started to appear, at least superficially it seemed, take control of large swaths of the supply chain, or at least control large parts of the supply chain itself. And Mexico suffered. Mexico became one of the most violent places in the world. We saw the explosion of violence since Calderon. We saw a proliferation of hyper-competitive and hyper-violent cartels, especially the Zetas. And this collusion between the military, the police, the elites, I think have led to eye-watering levels of violence, you know, and an extraordinary evolution of gruesome forms of violence that, of course, make media headlines around the world. And you guys have gone underneath those headlines and did some really deep diving into the Zetas. And so, Steve, tell us a bit about why the Zetas matter and how they fit in this picture of Mexico becoming kind of one of these dominant centers of crime.
It's a great question, and I do like the Zetas as an example because they illustrate a key bridge in this crime history story that we're trying to tell, and that is that they were the result of this proliferation of trafficking through Mexico. And the way that it evolved was that these groups in Mexico were beginning to, as Jerry pointed out, take larger and larger pieces of the pie. And as they took larger and larger pieces of the pie, or extended their control over a greater amount of that distribution chain and made more money, they understood that they needed to compete in a way that was slightly different than they'd competed in the past. And what that meant was that they literally started to create mini armies, and you know, what may have been called paramilitary groups in other spaces like Colombia. They were really mini armies, and the Zetas was the premier mini army. They were ex-special forces guys from the Mexican military that were employed by the Gulf cartel to be their enforcers and extend the influence of the Gulf cartel or ward off rivals. And other groups started to create similar groups like this. Over time, the Gulf cartel and the other groups that created these mini armies understood that they had to pay these mini armies. Mm-hmm. And so they began to give them sort of a longer and longer criminal leash. So increasingly, these mini armies got involved in other criminal activities, their own criminal activities, so they could kind of self-fund And that's where you start to see a tremendous proliferation of violence in spaces like Mexico, because we're not just talking then about international drug trafficking organizations. We're talking about organizations that are operating and doing criminal activities in Mexico, right? Those are domestic criminal operations. This is theft and resale. This is contraband. This is prostitution. This is kidnapping and extortion. These are all these activities that groups like the Zetas, because they were given a longer leash, begin to do. And that's what you have now still in Mexico. You have the sort of remnants of the Zetas, because over time, the Zetas becomes the focal point of efforts. And as Jerry pointed out, there is this sort of two-pronged story. And the effort to quell what the Zetas were doing largely works. The Zetas was split into a dozen different groups. They became repressed. But the Zetas model of getting involved in these domestic criminal activities, it persists because the barrier of entry for these activities is much lower. So now you have a proliferation of Zetas-like groups around Mexico competing for these domestic criminal economies. And then, of course, you do still have some of these larger, more sophisticated international drug trafficking groups that have these varying and, sort of dynamic alliances and rivalries with all of these lower level groups. So you can imagine the chaotic environment that creates, and that's what Mexico is living through right now.
Yeah, that disequilibrium. People often talk about violence, organized criminal violence, as being a function or result of the disequilibrium, the lack of a bargain. And you're constantly looking for new bargains. And as those bargains break, you see more competition, therefore more violence. And when you have a proliferation of these groups, as you said, things get out of control. I guess the next question, I'm sorry to put you in the spot here, Steve, but is what the hell do you do about this wicked problem? There's so many different ways people talk about this, whether it's decriminalizing and doing kind of what Oregon is doing in the States and starting to have a more consistent drug policy with a big demander to the north of Mexico. It's about whack-a-mole. It's about going after the most violent cartels. And, it's about demobilization. It's about ground-up economic development program. What do you do if you were sitting and counseling AMLO right now? What would you be whispering into his ear, or would you even bother?
I don't think AMLO would be listening to me to start out with. But, I guess I kind of throw these things into three big buckets. And the first bucket is putting out the fire. And so you determine what is the biggest fire that you have right now. And I think those are the most violent criminal organizations, for me, rise to the top. So which one is the most violent? And that's been an approach that has proven somewhat successful, you might argue, in places like the United States, where you still have very vibrant criminal economies. They just don't operate in the open, and they understand implicitly that there are rules that govern their interactions, and that if they become too violent, then they can expect a huge public policy response. So maybe that's where you start. But of course, you've got other things, which maybe would be the second bucket, which would be you can target specific individuals who you think might get involved in these activities. So you can create programs, whether they're economic or social, or create alternatives for people who may be floating in that direction, who may be already involved in that. So you can have different types of intervention strategies. And then, of course, you mentioned this as well, this sort of long-term structural issues that you have to deal with. The inequality, the situation of inequality, or the way in which police forces are run and don't work. Those kind of really long-term projects, or other stuff that I know you've mentioned in other forums, such as early family intervention that deals with abuse in the home, whether it's sort of physical abuse or sexual abuse, those kinds of things. They're not very politically palatable, but this is the sort of three-pronged strategy that you could throw at issues like this.
Steve, we'll get a chance to dive into this now. I mean, I think there's some great work that was done by the likes of Thomas Abt and others who've done some reflection on what works and what doesn't to address some of this systemic violence. And I want to continue with you a little bit before jumping back to Jer, around an issue about which you know a lot, which is street gangs. And the history of these street gangs, I think, is fairly well known. You know, the rise of the Maras and the Pandillas, and, you know, the movement of refugees to LA and other big US cities, and of course, the arrival of Barrio 18 and MS 18 and others. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit, since you've just written a very successful book on the topic, about the phenomenal growth of these gangs from Central America into the United States, back into Central America, maybe how they become this sort of bugbear of U.S. foreign policy, military policy in the region, as well as, of course, domestic policy. And sort of help us shatter some of the myths and hyperboles, of which I just find myself being guilty of extending. Tell us what's really going on with these groups, their power today, their relationship with the penal system, perhaps, and their connection inextricably to U.S. policies around deportations, for example, and the rest. Walk us through the big highlight reel of the gang.
Well, I think, you know, if we want to just sort of go through some of the myths, and maybe that helps us understand better what the realities are, at least in my research and in our research as an organization, because we have been looking at this, you know, pretty closely for about 10 years. You know, the first sort of major myth about them is that they are one single organization. You know, we talk about the MS-13 as if it's some kind of, you know, concentrated group with a very clear leadership structure, and, you know, one guy at the top who's kind of moving around all the different pieces like he's looking at a chessboard or something like that, you know, and it's very far from the reality. It is a very dispersed organization. It varies widely from place to place, whether you're talking about its criminal economy or whether you're talking about the number of members in an individual cell, or what they call clique. Whether you're talking about their connections to politicians, it's just you know, a very difficult things to encapsulate in one single sentence. And, you know, it is a bit of this paradox, because they're victims in many respects. You know, they come from horrible backgrounds. Their families have very often been torn apart. They often have, you know, they're often victims of domestic abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, those sorts of things. Those are the kinds of commonalities that I have found in my research, and what led to the writing of the book is to sort of talk about these and contextualize these guys in that regard. But the other part of them is that they are victimizers. You know, they commit horrible acts, and the most notable of them are these expressions of collective violence, both outward towards their main rivals, in particular the 18th Street Gang, but also inward, an incredible amount of violence that they inflict on their own members. And this violence actually is, you know, very often described as irrational, and this is another myth about them. It isn't irrational. There are a lot of rules about this violence, and this violence services a lot of their own purposes. Perhaps the most important of which is it congeals them into this very strong group. So these collective expressions of violence really binds them together in many respects. So we don't necessarily think of these things like that. And I guess the last thing I would mention about them is that there's this notion that they're this grand criminal group, this group with this incredibly far reach and sophistication that can, you know, do things such as traffic drugs on an international level. And they cannot, and they do not. They are a rudimentary hand-to-mouth criminal organization that mostly lives off of extortion in most of the spaces. Now that doesn't mean that describes all of it, again, because it's not one single unit. And largely what draws them and keeps them inside these spaces are these social aspects of the gang. They're a community of sorts. So they're a social organization first, and they're a criminal organization second. And until we wrap our heads around that, then we'll have the gang problem. We've had the gang problem. The MS-13 has been around for 40 years. It's as big or bigger than it's ever been. and we think we can just jail our way out of the problem. But until we look at them as a wider social issue, then we won't deal with it in the way that I think will be adequate.
Yeah, and I think you've written a lot about this in InSight Crime. Your reporters have kind of done some really interesting deep dives, reflecting a little bit on, again, what works and what doesn't. And I think what's manifestly clear over time, over history, and over your writings is that the militarized, heavy-handed sort of mano dura style approach doesn't just offend liberal human rights sensibilities. It is just manifestly making the problem worse. And that by contrast, early childhood interventions, mentorship programs, work for cash, and sort of meaningful work, and upskilling programs and focused deterrence, this balanced and comprehensive approach seems to yield better outcomes. And I think one of the tragedies, I think, in the region, and again, you write about this extensively, is that even when those interventions that are launched and are supported by international actors or otherwise succeed, they tend to be short-circuited before they can have a more meaningful impact, or defunded or cut the moment austerity kicks in. And so I think this is a problem that, as you say, will continue and persist unless it's dealt with in a fundamentally different way than is often the case in the region. But I want to turn to you, Jeremy, now, especially referring back to something when we talked about Colombia, about states having been infiltrated by organized crime, and in some cases really collapsing as a result of it. I think no state is more emblematic of this. Collapse is perhaps too strong a word. Have been fundamentally altered. No state is more emblematic of this than Venezuela. And Venezuela is experiencing this interlocking political, economic, security, humanitarian crisis that threatens to engulf really the region of South America. We've got 6 million Venezuelans who are on the move, including 2.5 million refugees, ranking it as one of the worst humanitarian disasters, and certainly one of the least talked about humanitarian disasters in the world today, right there in South America. You have been really focused on Venezuela. You both, but you, Jeremy, in particular, not just on the spectacularly bad governance, but also the role of organized crime at the heart of governance, the so-called cartel of the sun. And you've done this incredible research over the years, uncovering this network of drugs, of oil, of gold smuggling, and so much more. Walk us through what is really going on in Venezuela behind the headlines, if you can.
I think the first thing to say, Rob, is if you want to criminalize a state, the Bolivarian Revolution is a very effective blueprint. In 1999, before Chavez took over, Venezuela was one of Latin America's success stories. Stable politically, economically thriving, had vast numbers of problems that obviously were the reason that Chavez was elected, but they weren't criminal problems. You've mentioned the key issue was distribution of wealth, and all this oil money was not going to improve the life of the ordinary Venezuelan. Chavez came in promising to do that, but the collateral damage of the Bolivarian Revolution opened the door wide open to organized crime. First, after the 2002 coup against Chavez, as a counterbalance against the military, he begins to arm all sorts of non-state armed actors. And then he says to the Colombian guerrillas who share a close ideological affinity to the Bolivarian Revolution, hey, come and set yourselves up along the Colombia border. You'll be a great buffer to an increasingly hostile U.S. backed Colombian government. And so the guerrillas happily populate the border. Cocaine begins to spill across thanks to the Colombian connections. And we go to a country, we go from a country that had actually almost no serious organized crime structures in the late 90s, Venezuelan, because most of it was controlled by the Colombians, to the situation today where Venezuela is exporting organized crime. And we believe that in the next 5 years, based on the accelerated growth of Venezuelan organized crime, be it in the form of the prison-based planes and trenes, or be it the mega bandas, they'll be sitting at the top criminal table with the Colombians, with the Brazilians, and with the Mexicans. Chavez dismantled civil society in the sense of investigative journalism. He dismantled the checks and balances in the justice system. He politicized the police and the security forces. And all through government, promotion was based on political loyalty, not merit. So we have a hollowed out state. You then add to that sanctions. And the only export that Venezuela really had under the Bolivarian, under the Chavista governments, with the appropriation of much of the private sector, was oil. You slap on sanctions onto oil, and suddenly the government is completely bankrupt. They continue to print monopoly money that no longer allows anyone on a state wage to even feed themselves adequately. And so the government needs to turn increasingly to criminal rents, gold, cocaine, and all forms of smuggling. And if you rely on criminal rents increasingly to survive, well then those that run those criminal economies suddenly get a seat at the political table. And Maduro has created a power structure that's based around criminality. And of course, since he can no longer pay all the political apparatus through oil, he's now given them concessions. Away you go, extract what you can. Mr. Freddy Bernal, I'm going to make you the protector of Táchira, which is a province on the frontier. Listen, you're getting no money from me. Not only that, but I need money from you. So Freddy Bernal goes out there, makes alliances with the Colombian guerrillas of the ELN, sets up a new colectivo, the frontier border security, and they suddenly start controlling contraband, drug trafficking, everything else. So we now have a criminalized state. We have an evolution of organized crime, state-embedded and outside the state, which are increasingly fusing with the Maduro regime. And don't ask me what works, because rebuilding Venezuela after this and seeking to re-establish not only a working democracy, but trustworthy security forces, and undermining this culture of criminality that's been, for many Venezuelans, a survival mechanism, particularly over the last 5 years, is just a Herculean task.
I just want to, I'm not going to ask you what works. I always go to Steve for the policy stuff, and my question to you, though, and you raised it earlier in terms of building in the Caribbean to your analysis increasingly. I mean, you've always had a focus on some of the countries in the Caribbean, but I think increasingly now you see this as a really important region, sub-region in its own right. Talk us through a little bit about some of these trans-regional or even global dynamics of the Venezuelan crime story. I mean, I think what people often don't realize is that Trinidad and Tobago is literally right there, like it's right off the coast. And people used to describe to me how when the radar wasn't working at night on the Trinidadian side, it would light up like the Normandy invasions, in terms of the number of go-fast boats that were speeding along laden with all manner of contraband. Walk us through a bit of the regional dimensions of the Venezuela story, if you can. And I'm going to add one more little layer to this, because it's coming in from some of the people who are listening. If you can also think about even the global players, China, Russia, others, and what role they might be playing in part of the story. And I will ask you a little bit about how you deal with them.
Okay. Perhaps to start with the global bit first. For the last 20 years, the Venezuelan people have been bombarded with propaganda that the gringos are coming to steal our oil.
Right.
Okay? And this is an immensely important factor in understanding the psyche of the Bolivarian Revolution, of Maduro, and any kind of international solutions, interventions, and influence over the Venezuela situation. The Russians are loving poking Uncle Sam in the eye. It's not quite as good as Cuba, but you know what? It's certainly got deeper pockets, and the Russians have been actually surprisingly important in propping up the electricity system, which keeps collapsing, the communications system, and they've been very good at selling Venezuelan oil, circumventing some of the sanctions. The Chinese are obviously not as aggressive. They're much more interested in the money. And so, you know, so long as China keeps receiving its share of the increasingly small pie or flow of Venezuelan oil, then they're quite happy to see the Maduro regime continue. The Cubans are the best intelligence service in Latin America, bar none. And they're also the best at community-level intelligence gathering and social control. They have happily shared these lessons with the Venezuelans, and they have the spotlight on the Venezuelan military as one of the arbiters of power in Venezuela, ensuring that any time there looks like a wobble, there's a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and someone carts you off to a dark cell in the SEBIN, the secret police. In criminal terms, a lot of the story that we've already discussed in terms of Central America and Mexico was the move, principally of the drug trade, but also the migration flows and various other contrabands up through Central America to the Mecca of the United States. Well, there's been a lot of attention paid, particularly on the Northern Triangle. US have been throwing money at various Central American allies, one, to stem the flow of drugs, and two, to stem the flow of migrants. And then suddenly organized crime has found, like water, the path of least resistance. Well, there's no resistance in Venezuela. And so suddenly you can move cocaine into Venezuela, cost you next to nothing. How do you then get it to the markets of the US, or increasingly Europe and Asia, as the Colombians diversify their markets? Well, you can get it into then no trouble. Unfortunately, you can't hide it because Venezuela isn't exporting anything. So there's no wonderful containers you can slip it into, like in Brazil. There isn't a healthy commercial air bridge to anywhere, even pre-COVID. So you're building submarines. You're building go-fasts and launching them from the Venezuelan coast, and you're flying illegal flights, small, a single engine, maybe some double engine planes across the Caribbean. And so, of course, transnational organized crime has set up routes. Another great thing is it's a dollarized economy. You can spend your drug dollars and your drug euros without any dramas. Unfortunately, there's not much left to buy in Venezuela. If you're Venezuelan organized crime, that's fine. You can buy every property there is. You can buy land, etc., which presents us with another problem if and when we ever get to a democratic transition, because everything is now going to be owned by the oligarchia and organized crime. But perhaps the other thing you've mentioned is this diaspora. Organized crime loves a diaspora. Think of the Italians in the US. Think of the 'Ndrangheta now across Europe. The Venezuelans now have millions of their fellow citizens in desperate and dire straits across Latin America, and they are being preyed upon by organized crime in many different ways, and unfortunately they're being recruited in some cases by organized crime because they have no alternatives. They're living illegally in the countries that they're currently resident in, and they've got to feed the family. So another nightmare scenario for the future.
Well, let us not end on nightmares. Let us end on maybe a more optimistic view. And the first is that you guys have made it to 10, and you managed to survive it, and you managed to grow a wonderful team. And I think we could go on, but unfortunately we've reached the time to say goodbye. At least 2 or 3 of the topics that I was hoping we'd cover on the invisibility of crime, I think you've covered. You've mentioned the rise of environment crime as a theme for the future. I know digital and cybercrime is something that both of you are thinking hard about, but I want to give just in one sentence, if there's a topic that you want to hit in the next 10 years that you're excited about, and you want to give us a little hint is coming, I want to give you each an opportunity in a sentence to tell us what's in the pipeline, what's coming, because we're all eager to know. So maybe to Steve, a sentence. What do you want to work on in the future that's new and novel and it's going to help us understand what's going on in the region?
Yeah, I did touch on this a little bit earlier, and it has to do with this question of masculinity. I think that we underplay how important masculinity is in the construction of these groups, and how, everything from sort of cutting off avenues of expressing masculinity and the way in which that can lead to the construction of things like street gangs, to the way in which, the threat of being emasculated in an environment like a prison can also lead to the construction of very powerful groups. So I think I want to sort of, in terms of what InSight Crime can do, I want to start to, hopefully we can start to push the boundaries on these questions, so that I think like we did with elites in organized crime, maybe we can refocus the lens a little bit.
Brilliant.
Sentence, sorry.
Jeremy?
As you know, Rob, absolutely no issues with masculinity, so I'm going to move in a completely different direction.
Right.
I'm really keen to rip the fig leaf off state-embedded organized crime. We know that some of the top criminals now are sitting in Congress, even sitting in presidential palaces, or certainly atop economic elites. And they are not being challenged. They are enjoying utter impunity, and I want to rattle the cages. So yeah, that's what I like to do, some targeted rattling.
Good trouble, as they say. Listen, both of you, congratulations. Thanks to you. Thanks to the listeners and the viewers. Thanks to your team who've expertly put this together, as always, with a high degree of professionalism that impresses all of us. And keep well and keep working.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rob.
Really appreciate it.
Cheers.
We want to just a few announcements. We have our annual Game Changers 2020 coming out in the next few weeks. This is where we go back over the year and really pull out the main themes and patterns that we've found in organized crime around the region. The second is that we have our annual gathering or conference, international conference with the Universidad de Rosario in Bogota. Of course, it'll be virtual this year. And that will take place on December 3rd. And we'll cover, which won't be a surprise to anybody watching us, COVID and crime and the evolution of crime amidst this pandemic. We've got a number of regional events that we're having, so keep an eye out for those. They'll be happening in all of these places where we've been doing deep dive investigations over the last few years. I'll give you a couple of the highlights there. Paraguay, that might be a surprise to some of you. We haven't done any events there, so we'll do one that will focus on that. Argentina, Brazil, Guatemala, El Salvador, some of the usual suspects, but some a little bit out of the ordinary. So keep an eye out for those. And we're going to launch a new website in 2021. That will be super exciting. And those of you who are supporters of us, hopefully you'll be able to, even if you feel up to it, actually give us a little bit of assistance financially. So we'll finally come up with a way in which you can help us out directly, even if it's small donations and whatnot. But that will be coming in 2021. Second, I just wanted to have a few thank yous. We can't do this sort of thing without a tremendous team behind us. Especially, I would thank Maria Elena Ortegon, Elisa Roldan, Alexa Urrea. The three of them and many, many others worked tirelessly to put this together. Obviously, Rob and Juanita for joining us this morning and giving us some tough questions and some great ways to think about this organization over the years. So we really appreciate your contributions this morning. Thank you very much. And finally, a heartfelt thanks to my partner, Jeremy McDermott. Jerry, don't worry, I'm not going to get mushy on you or anything like that. But, it's been quite a run. And I wanted to say thanks for all you do. Third, just a final thought about the future. As we look around, there's so much we couldn't have predicted, as everybody knows. And just specifically to us, we didn't expect to have 50 people working for us. We didn't think we would be doing projects in 17 countries in a single year, which is what we did last year. We didn't think we'd have staff that could speak a half dozen languages and that were operational in more than a dozen nations. All of these things we could have never predicted. But I guess if we were going to look to the future and we could predict one thing, and that is that organized crime is going to be with us. We don't know if it'll be as lucrative or as violent or as political, but, it'll definitely be there. And we'll definitely be there as well. We're going to be there scooping up the information from the ground, or as the case is now, maybe via encrypted messaging services. We'll be putting together the briefs and the analyses and the investigations and the criminal profiles that you guys have come to rely on. And we'll be developing the sexy maps and graphics that you guys can share via your very vibrant social media channels that I'm sure you have. And finally, we'll be presenting our findings in public and private forums. So, if you're still with us, and we appreciate all of your efforts to be with us, maybe you'll be with us then in 10 years when we take a look back on, 20 years of InSight Crime. So thank you all for being here this morning, and thank you all for your support over the years.